Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome, everybody. This is a presentation on managing the transition to XML, or can also be considered managing the transition to structured authoring. My name is Simon Bate. I'm from Scriptorium Publishing, and I'll be giving the presentation today. Just a little bit about me. Again, my name is Simon Bate. I'm a senior technical consultant at Scriptorium. I'm also a certified technical trainer. I've had about 30 years, more than 30 yees experience in TechCom. I always like to say 10 years as a writer, 10 years as a manager, and then the last 10 or more years doing what I really love, and that's tools development. I've had, with Scriptorium, about 5 years of experience working in DITA and the DITA Open Toolkit, creating specializations, authoring in DITA, any number of things like that. A little bit about Scriptorium. We're a consultancy. We focus on content strategy for technical communication. Typically, a client will come to us. They need to shift to XML, or they need to localize to all of a sudden 20 different languages. They have an old set of outmoded tools. They need to move to a newer set of tools. We will help analyze their situation. We will help them develop a content strategy. We can then help implement that strategy. We can transform documents if needed to whatever that implementation is, and we can also deliver training. So just a real brief summary here of what we're going to be covering. First, I'm going to talk for quite a while about what to expect in the transition to XML, the transition to structured authoring. We'll take a brief trip through what you're not to do in transitioning to XML, and then we'll talk about the Scriptorium 12-step plan for the transition to XML. So first off, what to expect. Well, of course, when you shift from unstructured authoring to structured authoring, your writers are going to need to transition to topic-based authoring. And the idea here is instead of writing lengthy chapters about your content, instead you write individual topics. They're self-contained units that address a single topic, and that way you can keep your information in reusable sets. Now, it is possible to do some structured authoring without shifting to a topic-based authoring, but if you choose to go that route, you're going to miss out on several of the big wins, and the real big one here is reuse. The idea in structured authoring, as you're authoring in small self-contained units, then you can reuse, reorganize those units, those topics, into different outputs. Also, if you're structuring without using topic-based authoring, it's very difficult to store the information in a content management system or a component content management system. Now, as part of this change in the authoring process, you certainly do have a lot of unstructured legacy content, and you're going to need to consider whether you want to transform that, convert it to structure, or is it time to make a break and re-author your information. And a lot of that just depends on the nature of how you've been writing thus far. So in the transition to XML, as you transition to XML, there will be changes to the roles and skills in your teams. Of course, in XML, one of the big things in XML is there's a separation of content and formatting. Your content creators are going to focus merely on creating the content. The formatting chunk is left up to tools such as the DITA Open Toolkit or other transformation engines that will transform your content into the actual output. And because of the separation, your writers no longer have to focus really on making sure that, or they don't have to look at their text and make sure that there's enough space above and below heads, that things look nice on the page, because you're not going to be focusing just on print output. You don't know, or a content creator doesn't know when they create a topic how that's finally going to be used. Or it may be used in a number of different ways. It may be used in print, it may be used in EPUB, it may be used in help, it could be used in a number of different ways. So it doesn't really make sense to spend the time trying to look at the formatting. Because of this, in traditional unstructured authoring, you often have a set of people who look at the way things are being laid out on page, these production editors, and correct the tag usage, correct spacing, correct line breaks, correct pagination, things like that. So as you shift to XML, there's not going to be such a need for these people. Also, if you're in unstructured, you're probably using a tool like FrameMaker or Word, and you probably have some experts, and they know how to create the FrameMaker templates, modify them. These people, it's probably a good idea for them to look around and get skills on some of the areas where there will be more demand, such as XSLT experts. As you transition to XML, the output is going to be, your outputs are generated in transformations. In XML, typically the language that's used for these transformations is XSLT. So if you have experts in FrameMaker templates right now, they need to be looking at gaining skills on doing XSLT transformations, on using various markup languages that are used for the output. And that takes me to the next bullet here, which is XSLFO. If you're generating PDF from XML sources, typically what you do is you transform your XML into an intermediate language called XSLFO. And then the XSLFO is then processed through a separate engine that then generates your PDF. So XSLFO is rather complex language, rather esoteric, and it's a good idea to learn XSLFO if you're in the position of being a template expert right now. Also, there will be more demand for developmental editors, because as you're creating topics, you're going to need somebody guiding your team through and saying, these are the areas where topics are needed. This is the way they need to be formed. This is the your developmental editors need to help in making sure that the topics are authored consistently, because that way, as the topics are reassembled in your output to the user, it doesn't appear like all the pieces of information came from different people writing in different ways, but more that the information is presented as a whole. Also a good idea when dealing in topics to have a content librarian or a curator, because after a while you're going to accumulate rather a large number of topics, and you will need to, if you're going to reuse those topics, someone's going to have to look at the topics, examine them, know what's there, and when an author says, I need to create a new topic, the content curator, the content librarian can say, well, there's already an existing topic that covers this. This person needs that kind of knowledge of the content that's available. Or the content curator might say, okay, what you need to create is a little bit more different than what's in the content management system right now, so it's time to take that existing topic and branch it to create a derivative topic. Also, the content librarian is the person who should go through all of your content from time to time and look and see, are there topics that are no longer used? Are the topics that are old? Should these be removed? Sort of tend the garden, as it were. So of course, when you transition to structure, there will also be tool changes. So right now, if you're in unstructured, you're probably using something like FrameMaker or Word. There is a new set of tools, a new set of very useful tools for editing structured content, for editing in XML. And we find that they are really useful. Now, some of the providers of these older tools, FrameMaker and Word and so on, will say, well, there are add-ons, there are things you can create structure, you can create XML using our tools. And yes, if you look at things, you can see there are bullet items, there are checkoff lists, and they can say, yes, they provide this, yes, they provide that. But one of the things to really keep in mind when evaluating or thinking about what tool you want to use for creating your XML is just day-to-day use. It's one thing if the tool meets all of these, the checkoff list, but it's another thing if in day-to-day use. So I was talking about tool changes, and that we have there are a new breed of editors that we can use for maintaining our XML. As I was saying, some of the older tools may say that they meet some line items, but in day-to-day use, we're finding that the newer XML tools are a whole lot better for creating XML or structured content. Now, one other thing that you have to get used to in the transition to structure is that what you see on screen in these editors is just one representation of the way the information can appear. We've been used to WYSIWYG. We've been used to WYSIWYG tools for quite a while now, more than 20 years, and so what you see is what you get. And what we'd like to talk about now these days is WYSIWYG. So what we say is what you see is one option, and that is, as I was talking before, as you when you create your content, that content may be used in help, it may be used in PBS, it may be used in EPUB, any number of different things. Hang on just a second, I have to check one more thing here. My apologies. Okay, great. Just a little bit more technical stuff here. So what you have to get used to is the fact that the tools will display just a representation of the way the information might look. And this is a useful thing, actually, that the tool will then present for you. If you're creating a bulleted list, the tool will create something that looks like a bulleted list. If you enter something that's a title, the tool will create something that looks just like, is somewhat like a title in your books. There's space between paragraphs, all those things. So that way, as you're authoring, you get a sense of what you're looking at and what you're doing. Now, another thing in authoring in XML, authoring in structure that's different from unstructured is you'll need to create, or your content creators will need to create a bunch of metadata, that is additional information about your topics. So this is things like who is the SME, who's the subject matter expert, who's the author, who last maintained this, when was the last time you made a change, which version of the product does this text apply to, what platform is it for, what's the audience. There's any number of pieces of information about the information. And this is one real big thing that takes some getting used to in creating XML and creating structured topics. I heard someone say a long time ago, and I've always hung on to this saying, is that your metadata is only as good as your laziest writer. That metadata is really important, and it's good to cultivate an environment where creating this metadata is, people understand the need for it and why to do it. Another thing about the tool changes is because people are going to be getting used to new tools, you've got to expect that, at least initially, there will be some loss of productivity during the transition to the new tools. Of Creating graphics is different in XML and structure. In XML, the graphics are separate from your actual XML content. They exist as files, separate files. And as a result, most of the XML editors we have these days don't have integrated tools, and there's no reason they should have an integrated tool for creating the graphics. And of course, the model that I'm thinking of here is, as most of us probably have been creating documents in FrameMaker, we're used to working in FrameMaker and importing, say, a screenshot by reference, but then using the FrameMaker tools to draw callouts and things on top of that. And that callout information remains part of the XML. That callout information remains part of the FrameMaker document. In XML, you can no longer do that. If you're going to put callouts on a screenshot, those callouts really need to be maintained in your graphics editor. A couple other things about graphics. So on the output side from XML, there's some of the older formats for graphics. There's some limited support. In particular, TIFF, there's limited support for TIFF these days. And EPS, encapsulated PostScript files. A lot of processors can handle them, but usually you have to do a few extra steps. Usually you have to do something else, like you have to create PostScript and then still run your PostScript through a distiller. So it's better if you can use a format that doesn't require so many extra steps. Now, there are some exciting possibilities in graphics using XML, and the two things I'm thinking about here mainly are SVG, the Scalable Vector Graphics Standard, and MathML. SVG is an XML-based vector graphic format. So in a vector graphic, of course, your file contains a series of instructions: start at this point and draw a line to that point, or draw a circle that has this as its center point and it has a radius of such and such number of pixels, or a radius of a certain size. These XML files can be created themselves by transforms. And so, for example, to cite one case, we have a client who does they're a large microprocessor company. They have information about the registers on the microprocessors, and all the information about those registers, all of the bit fields, the names of those bit fields, their length, their contents, all that is stored in XML. And it is possible for us to take that XML information and transform it and generate SVG output that will draw a picture of the way that register actually looks. And that way, in the reference manual for chips, you can actually see pictures of each of the registers, the bit offsets, and all sorts of things like that. So there's lots of opportunities. So generating SVGs from your sources is a really exciting possibility. MathML, it's very similar to the, if you're familiar with the FrameMaker mathematical formula editor, MathML is a similar thing, but it's in XML. And there are tools you can buy, tools you can find for maintaining, maintaining formulas in this XML format, MathML. And the same thing is true. You could conceivably construct MathML figures from your data. Now, creating new output formats is going to be different. Currently, if you're in the unstructured world, if you're using FrameMaker, when you need to create a new output, you ask your FrameMaker style sheet person to create a new template. They take either an existing template and modify it or build a new one. Similarly, in XML, when you need to create new output, you have to build new transforms. You can start with existing transforms, or you can create some transforms out of whole cloth. So, so for every new output format, you have to create this transformation, and then you make that transformation available for your content creators or through your output engine. Often you do that through something like the content management system. Now the good thing here in XML is, of course, once you've created this, once you've created the new output format, you can make it available to everybody to use. And again, with the separation of content and formatting, your formatting just works. The user will create some content, they will organize it in a certain way using a map or whatever, and then transform it using this new transform. And this is, in contrast with if you're, again, in FrameMaker, you have to create a template, and then the user has to apply that new template and then go through and make sure that everything still works in that template. So I've been referring several times to the component content management system. So as you create your topics, as you create your content, you're going to want to store that content in a reasonable way. And what we have for that is a component management system. So this allows you to check in topics, check them out, make sure that you don't have people trying to edit the same topic at the same time. You can identify a series of topics and say, these were all the topics in the current version that was used in a particular release of a product or the manual of a book, anything like that. And you can then label them. You usually use the content management system for generating output. So the content management system will give you a way of organizing your topics into a map or some other form of a table of contents, and then you tell the content management system, turn the crank, use this output format, generate my output. Another thing we can do with the component content management system is perform faceted searches. This is, of course, one of the great promises of moving to XML is you can search your content and say, I'm looking for a particular word that occurs inside a particular element, or inside an element that's inside an element inside another element, and so on. So you can have very directed searches. You can look for very specific pieces of information. Another thing the component content management system helps you do is it helps you with your reuse. And so you might be creating a document. You might need to assemble it from a series of topics. You might see one topic that almost meets your needs. It exists already in the content management system, but it needs some small tweaks. And you need to know then, okay, what other documents, what other outputs use this topic. So then you can query the content management system, and it can tell you precisely which outputs, which deliverables use that topic. So then you can see, will your modifications hurt, damage, harm those outputs, or do you are you going to need to create a new topic, or will it work with all of those other existing topics? Training and education. As you transition to XML, I like to draw a distinction here between two parts of what you need to do. The first is training, and training for me is actually learning a specific tool or learning a methodology. This is you'll need to work with your content creators, also work with the people for your information systems groups. Help them learn how to use specific tools. Now, content creators, of course, are going to have to learn how to use the XML editor, graphics tools, check-in, check-out with the content management system. Information systems people are important because the content management system itself is going to require some management, and they're going to need training in that. Now, education, though, I view as a much broader thing, and education means essentially cluing people in, letting people know that you have new processes. You want to spread the word to any of the people who you're going to interact with, anybody who's going to participate in your reviews, anybody who helps you in your creation of your content and the creation of the deliverables. They're going to need to know that your processes are changing, and they're going to need to know what are the ways they're changing. And of course, this includes management. And speaking of management, you're also going to want to help set your management expectations. Of course, as I just mentioned, this really includes your IT team. As my colleague Alan Pringle said in the blog post just the other day, it's very important to make nice with your IT group, because they're going to be helping you. They're going to be they're an important part of this transition to XML. So another expectation to set with the management is just when the cost savings will occur. So maybe drop dead obvious, but of course right out of the box, when you implement the system the first time around, you're not going to see cost savings. But the cost savings of XML you're going to see in the second time, third time, and so on as you go through your process. That's when the cost savings are going to occur. The other thing to work with management and setting management expectations is get them thinking about what they can do now that you're in XML. What could they do that they couldn't do before? For example, we had a client, and they had to produce for their management every Monday a report of all the things that changed in their documents in the last week. And in an unstructured world, this was quite difficult for them to do. It was always late, it was always inaccurate. As they moved to structure, they started using the metadata in the structure to track who was making changes. And with our help, we generated for them, we helped them create a report, and that was automatically generated from all of their sources. And they could run the tool, and it was on management desk bright and early Monday morning. And so management was very, very pleased about seeing that kind of a change. So there's a lot of things in XML that are beyond just documenting your product that that you can really use to help things. Another is setting your expectations. I'm speaking a lot here to managers that you're going to find, the structured authoring isn't for everybody. There's some people who are just really fixed, set in the world of creating long chapter-oriented documents and creating self-contained single topic or single focus topics is they might find limiting. They might find working in structured tools somewhat limiting. And some of them will get upset. Now, some of them may be upset enough to leave, but a lot of people will come around. And I was chatting with someone just a month ago or so about how her experience with the authors. And they did have some initial reservations about the tools, but the more and more they used them, the more and more they said, how could we ever have done, how could we ever do what we're doing now with the older tools? That it's a really good shift that we've made. So people will come around to that. So in moving to structure, here's first what not to do. And we see this all the time. Someone will pick a content model that is an architecture, or they'll pick a tool, or even worse, they'll pick a tool and then pick a content model. They'll train the writers on the tool, they'll convert all their documents, and then go. Or at least that's what they think. So when they pick the content model, what criteria did they use for picking that content model? When they picked the tool, did they really make sure they picked a tool that matched the deliverables? How do you know the tools that you're going to use are going to match the deliverables you have to create? They trained the writers on the tools, but assuming, well, the writers are the only ones who really needed to know about the tool. But as we've seen, there are a number of other people who do need to know. They convert their content. It should be a one-to-one mapping from our current unstructured content to all these data topics and everything, right? So they failed. So instead of this off-the-cuff plan, we propose the Scriptorium 12-step plan for transitioning to content, to structured content, or transitioning to XML. And we'll talk through each of these individual steps. So the first step is we need to create a content strategy. Now, if you need, we have a number of resources about creating about content strategy. We have available on our website webcasts that Sarah has delivered on content strategy, number of other tools on creating content strategy. This is a very important place to start. So with your content strategy, you need to set up initially, what are the goals? What are the business goals? What are the goals? What are you trying to achieve by this transition to XML, transition to structure? And at the same time, it's a good idea to create some metrics. Say, as we're going to these goals, we're going to these goals for these reasons. And usually if you're going to say for these reasons have to have numbers attached to them. And so those numbers come from your metrics. Once you set up your goals, you need to create a strategy. So how are you going to go about meeting those goals? And finally, you have to have some tactics. That is, in order to implement the strategy, you need to figure out exactly what you're going to do. All of this should be documented and well spelled out in a content strategy. Now, as part of this content strategy, you also want to consider your deliverables. So, and this is not just the type. This is not just, are we creating reference manuals or help or reference cards or user's guides, things like that. You also want to think about what is the media we're going to be using. Are you going to be creating PDFs? Are you going to be creating EPUB? Are you going to be creating help? What are you going to be creating? How often are you going to be producing your deliverables? So is it once a month? Is it once a year? What's the frequency? And what's your audience? What is your audience doing when they're using your document, or what environment are they in? And then, of course, you may also, for the tools, you may have particular requirements or particular constraints for those tools. So your shop may be, you may have a shop that says, well, we're open source only, or you may have a shop that says we're absolutely opposed to using anything open source. You may have other constraints on the tools that you choose. So all of this information comes from your content strategy, and it's very important in your transition to XML. Our second step in the transition is defining the roles and responsibilities. And so this is not overall departmental roles. This is in the transition, as we shift, who's going to do what in the transition. So who's going to help develop our education? Who's going to do the actual development? Who's going to create our transformations? Who's going to be responsible for tool maintenance? Who's going to be the reviewers of all of the information that we create about this transform? And who's going to be the final approval? Who's going to have the final approval for this, for your transition? If you're using consultants to help you in the transition, it's very good at this point to establish who is responsible for what. Step 3, establish your milestones. This is important because when you have a schedule, then you have accountability. If you don't have a schedule, then people are always going to look at what you need to do and say, oh, well, whenever, and it's going to get low priority, and after a while you're going to find you're making no headway because you're constantly getting pushed off. If you have a schedule, you can then use that schedule to say, I need this at this point, and you then have the accountability. It also helps maintain scope. We're all familiar with the concept of scope creep. If you have a schedule, you can say, if you have milestones, you can say, well, that's a good idea, that's a nice idea, think about 2.0 right now. If we were to add that, it would stretch out our scope. It would stretch out our schedule by so much we can't do it at this time. As you're creating your milestones, make sure you include some slack for delays. It's nice to be optimistic and say, oh, this will happen, things will happen, one right after the other. But there are going to be delays. It's an inevitable part of business. And in particular, your reviewers may not necessarily be available exactly when you need them, so you have to allow some slack there. Step 4, you want to perform a structural analysis. And a lot of this should have come from your content strategy. But you need to examine your current content and understand what are the pieces. I was thinking about this the other day and thinking it's like taking a product and trying to figure out what kind of container that product is going to fit in. You know, is it a liquid? Is it a solid? Is it a gas? So with that, what shape of container? What kind of container do I need? You need to look at your content and think and figure out for each different type, each different piece of content, what is the right container for that content. And then you also have to figure out how do those pieces all fit together. So this in creating this structural analysis, this then leads you to choose or create a content model and an architecture in XML for your content. At the same time you're understanding what your content is, it's a good idea to develop a taxonomy. That is nothing more than a series of names that you associate with things. So you can look at a piece of information and say, oh, this is a concept. Or look at a piece of information and say, oh, this is a title. This is a figure. Just put names on everything. This is your taxonomy, and it again helps you map from your current model to the new model. Also at this time, it's a good time to consider what's the information about the information. What's the information you need to store away in each topic that the metadata that you're going to be using for driving your processes. Again, keep your content strategy in mind. So why does the content exist and what needs is it meeting? You may also find a point you can say, well, this content exists, but we don't really see the need for this. Is it really worth maintaining? Another thing to think about at this time is what are some future requirements? This is crystal ball time. How are you going to be using your content in a year, in 5 years? What can you be doing now that will help shape the path for what you might be doing then? Now we reach a point we need to come up with an architecture. That is an architecture, a content model. So based on your analysis of your content, you can either choose an existing architecture, and some of the popular ones, of course, are DITA, S1000D, and still to some degree DocBook. There are places where it works. It all depends on what your needs are. Or you may find that based on your content model, based on your structural analysis, you really need to create something very special for your content. And so at that point, you need to start to create the DTD or schema that defines exactly how all the pieces fit together. And by content model, all I mean is a piece of information that says a bulleted list consists of a UL tag or a UL element that contains one or more LI elements, or a topic begins with a title, it contains a short description, and then contains a body. That type of information is in your content model. After you choose your architecture or have created your content model, you also need to start looking at creating your output transformations. Now, step 6 we'll get to in just a minute is the pilot, and I'd recommend before your pilot you may want to consider just creating just one output transformation. And this might be either the most, it might be the most common transformation that you're going to be using. So, if you're generating a lot of PDFs, maybe you want to focus on your PDF transformation. If you're, or you may want to focus on which one's the most risky, which one's going to take the most work to get it to the point where you think it's production ready. So, but fundamentally, the output transformation you create first, you want it to be enough to test most of your assumptions. So step 6 is your pilot, and this is something we highly recommend. We do have some clients who just choose to go straight from choosing the architecture and then launch full-on to spreading it throughout their organization. A pilot is good in many ways, and for a pilot, you want to choose a candidate project, and the best project for your pilot is not necessarily the largest or your smallest project. Largest often means there's a lot of work you spend going through things that really don't need worrying about, and it just slows the process down. Smallest means it may not contain a full representation of all of the things we need to look out for in doing transformation, or all of the things that your writers may encounter in creating topics. Instead, what you want to do is find something that is the most representative of all of your projects. And the main reason you're looking at doing a pilot is that you want to ensure that all of your assumptions are correct. You want to make sure that everyone's on the same page. I'm reading off slides. You want to make sure that the people are communicating. We had one case where we created a transformation, an implementation in XML for one team, and in a fairly large company, and they were very happy with it. And after a while, another group in the company found out about this and said, "Oh, we'd like to use that too. Here's a project. Here's here's a pilot. We'd like to see what happens because we figure, it'll come out just right." So we ran things through, handed them back the output, and they said, "Oh, wait a minute, this is supposed to look like our stuff, not like their stuff." And so there was a case where there wasn't a lot of communication about the way things, there wasn't a lot of communication between the groups about the way things were going to appear. The pilot, but through running the pilot, we were able to check that and say, "Oh, these are the things we need to do in order to get your output to look the way you want it to look." And don't be afraid of doing pilots, because I've rarely seen it where anybody doing a pilot actually halted a transition to XML. Instead, people use the pilots just for course correction. Now, these next steps, most of the remaining steps, actually can be done at any time during the entire transition. Well, I don't need to say much more there, but these are essentially asynchronous things. At some point, once you've established your content strategy, you're going to want to also develop a strategy for dealing with your legacy content. As I said at the outset of this presentation, some content works very well moving from unstructured to structured. Other content, because of its nature, it may have a whole number of different types of things all folded together. Because of its nature, it is very difficult to transform it automatically into XML, into structured content. So in developing your legacy strategy, you want to consider, do we want to attempt some automatic conversion of this content, or is it a good time to sit down and re-examine the content and rewrite the content carefully in a topic-based way? And like I say here, the bullet depends on the quality. So you convert your legacy documents if you need to, And another thing to consider in conversion is, do you want to convert it all at once, or do you just want to convert things as you need them? Developing training. When you develop the training for the transition, you're going to want to give people, as part of the training, the whole background and rationale. It's always useful for people to have as much information as possible about things. So tell them, why was it that you decided to make this move out of unstructured into structure? It's good for them to have a basic background in structured authoring and XML concepts. And then you, of course, need to focus on using the authoring tool, using the content management system, and in using the content management system, good idea to teach not just how to check in, how to check out, but what's the overall flow, what's the process of creating and maintaining pieces of information in a content management system. You may also need training on other tools. For instance, you probably need some training on a graphics tool if people aren't familiar with creating their graphics in something else. You also need to develop some documentation. So this is documentation about the documentation. Again, your documentation should include some background rationale about why you're making this transition to structure. You need to explain the structure itself, so explain the content model, explain what each piece is. Now, if you do move to something like DITA or DocBook, there are lots of good reference works on all of the elements in DITA, and so those will take this place in your documentation. But in addition to just the referencey stuff, you also, it's a good idea to develop some recommendation for best practices. What's the best way of creating a topic? How to organize your information, that type of thing. You also need to develop some in-depth technical docs. So this is mostly developer-oriented. The people who've developed your tools, the people who developed your transformations, they may or may not stick around. So when it comes time to make some modification down the road, it's a good idea if things are documented. Also, a good idea for your outputs if you have some form of specification of those outputs. So for a level 1 head uses such and such a font at such and such a size. It has this much spacing above and below, this indent, and so on. We all know those types of things you can get from the FrameMaker paragraph creator, but it's a good idea to have all of that actually written down formally somewhere. Oh, one other thing back on the documentation and the best practices. One area where it's really important to assemble a set of knowledge about something is the application of inline tags, inline elements. I'm speaking from DITA experience here. In DITA, there's a number of domain specializations for software, for user interface, that type of thing. There's a number of elements that you can use for assigning, for wrapping inline content. And you may have a number of different items. It's a good idea to choose which of these elements are you going to use for which thing. Getting a little bit more specific, you may be, if you're, say, documenting an object-oriented system, you may have classes, you may have methods, you may have a number of other things in your object-oriented system. Every time you refer to a class, what element are you going to use to surround that class? Every time you refer to a method, what are you going to use? For your data, all the various parts of your system, you need to come up with a format that's going to be used for it. So it's a good idea. Do that early on and write it down. So we talked about change, and change is inevitable. And changes will occur to your system, to your transformations, to your content management system. So for this is typical of any deployment of a large complex system. There are going to be changes, and you need to manage those changes. So you need to, so the changes might occur, say, your structure. You may actually need to implement a new element, or you may need to add a new attribute. So you need to then track making that change through your system. Make sure that it appears in all the places it needs to appear in. As you have changes, you need to make sure you can roll them out in an organized manner. Also at this time, you might want to consider, do you want to have scheduled changes? So are you going to roll out your changes every 3 months, every 6 months, every year, or do you want to just make the changes on the fly as they're needed? And again, it depends on your situation. Some places it's a good idea for writers to have organized expectations about when changes are going to occur. Other places, you may need to be a lot more responsive, so you may need to just roll out a change very quickly. So it's up to your implementation. Then as things move along, your content creators, your writers are going to be ramping up to production, so they're going to start just standard day in, day out usage of your tools. So at this point, you're going to need to then shift from developing a new system to maintaining an existing system. And if you're using contractors, this is a really good time to make sure that in this transition, either you shift to in-house knowledge, so your contractors, pass their information over to your people in-house so that they can make changes, or you may want to, say, have a follow-on support agreement. You may want to set something up with your contractor so that they can or consultant, so that they can then maintain your system over the next several years. Finally, you want to evaluate what you've done. So you're finally there, so validate what you've done against your goals and metrics. You want to then report what you've done to management and enjoy what you've accomplished. And then you're off to the next thing. So all in all, content strategy really drives everything. This is a very important part of making a transition to XML. Make sure you set expectations. Make sure your expectations are set correctly. Your writer's expectations are set correctly. Your management's expectations are set. Plan, plan, plan. A pilot is a really good thing for helping with course correction. It's a very good idea. And then plan for change. Things do change, so you need to make sure that your plan includes plans for change. So I've got just a couple minutes here for questions. So let me see if there's anything in here in the question box. And at this point, we will end the recorded presentation. Here's a question. Let me grow this box here. Okay, what are some authoring? Here's a question. What are some XML authoring tools that you would recommend beyond FrameMaker? Certainly, the two main tools I think of in XML authoring are XML and Oxygen. And to be honest, my favorite tool to work with is Oxygen. I'm an unstructured FrameMaker from way back when, FrameMaker user from way back when, and I could, with the escape codes and everything, if my hands were on the keyboard and I was creating content, my hands could stay there and I wouldn't have to get distracted about going to the mouse or anything. I find in Oxygen, the flow of creating information is the same. I can keep my hand on the keyboard and just write and write and write, and I don't need to use the mouse. And so I find that, for me, is very, very effective. Now, it's a good idea to look at the other tools. Oxygen itself started as an XML offering tool for people creating all sorts of XML things, including XSL transformations, maintaining XML data. And so it can be a little bit geeky at times. XMetal, on the other hand, is much more oriented for basic content creation. It's much more of a writing tool. And it's a good idea also, in addition to this, separate tools to consider hosted services. Things like EasyData may be worth looking at, particularly if you're looking at data as your architecture. I hope that helps. All right. Okay. If there are no, let's see, I'll just leave it open for questions just for a little bit longer. Otherwise, if there are no questions, I'll say thank you. And again, I apologize for the technical difficulties we had there in the middle. And if you want, contact me and I can send you the slides. So, thank you all very much.